Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts. Now, here's Jim Dubois.
I'm standing on the rooftop of Rapson Hall on the University of Minnesota's Twin Cities campus. Behind me is an array of solar panels. When the Trump administration announced it was withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, there were concerns about the future of renewable energy in the United States. But here at the University of Minnesota and elsewhere, renewable energy is still strongly in focus. This month on Access Minnesota, a conversation with Ellen Anderson, who heads up the University of Minnesota's Energy Transition Lab. Ellen Anderson is Executive Director of the University of Minnesota's Energy Transition Lab. Professor Anderson, welcome to Access Minnesota.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
First of all, what is the Energy Transition Lab and what is its role at the University of Minnesota?
Well, we are a center housed at the University of Minnesota with the Institute on the Environment, and we also work closely with the law school and other colleges. And our mission is really to help enable the energy transition, to help our energy system get to that future, low carbon, more renewable, more intelligent, more resilient energy system. And we work collaboratively with stakeholders all across the state of Minnesota and beyond. And we work with all the many of the experts within the University of Minnesota as well, to try to harness many of those talents and work together collaboratively to find solutions.
The U of M is one of the largest universities in the country, with students and faculties in many different fields, and they're housed in many different colleges across the campus. How does the Energy Transition Lab bring together researchers from different areas at the University of Minnesota?
That's a great question, and we also aim to reach across the state and work with other campuses. So we've partnered with the Morris campus and the Duluth campus in particular, along with the Twin Cities. I'll give you an example. We work a lot on energy storage, which is kind of a game-changing technology that's going to help enable a lot of really important evolution in our energy systems. And to figure out how to deploy energy storage effectively to help our energy system be more efficient, more resilient, enable more renewable energy, it really takes a combination of technology innovation, market development, and legal, regulatory, and policy solutions. So that intersection is where we spend a lot of our time, bringing together scientists who are trying to develop new innovative technologies at a lower cost for renewable energy or for energy storage. And we work with legal experts and policy experts who are trying to figure out the rules of the road. And then we bring in other disciplines as well to help sort of put this whole package together, because that's the nature of energy. It's very interdisciplinary by nature.
President Donald Trump announced in June that the U.S. would withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. We'll discuss the possible effects of this decision later on in the interview. But first, what can you tell us about the Paris Agreement and what was accomplished back in December of 2015?
Yeah, well, I had the good fortune of being in Paris when that agreement was adopted. And it was a phenomenal moment in history to get all the countries of the world, all but two, literally, together to agree to take action on such a difficult and often politically divisive topic as climate change was historic and really quite monumental. And it was significant in part because it took so many years to get there. And so just a brief history is there were about 20 plus years of meetings after the UN participants, all these different countries, came together in the early 90s and said, we need to talk about climate change and try to take some action. And it took over 20 years of meetings to get to this point in Paris where there was actual agreement. And one of the big holdups was really a division between the wealthy countries that were the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases, like the United States and China, and the poorer countries that often are experiencing more of the impacts of climate change and didn't have the resources to try to prevent it. And so getting all of those people to the table to work together was a major accomplishment after 21 years. And that's what happened in Paris, that people kind of overcame those differences and said, this is too important. We have to work together. The other thing about the agreement that I think is really significant, well, there's a couple other things I can mention. One is that it's kind of a bottom-up process, and that's part of what helped them get to agreement, was that this time the proposal was, instead of setting a binding numerical target for all the countries to follow, like was done in the Kyoto Protocol, saying thou shalt reduce this much emissions. That's not what it says. Instead, the Paris Agreement says each country figure out your most aspirational target that you think you can meet, given your resources, your economy, your energy mix, your population, your demographics, everything, and come to the table with that commitment. And then the agreement itself doesn't set those targets. Instead, the agreement holds each other accountable and says, we're all pledging that we're going to work together, we're going to measure our progress, and we're going to come back regularly and take stock of our progress. And we're all going to commit to try our very best in our own countries to reduce emissions at least 2 degrees and keep warming to at least under 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, and preferably below 1.5 degrees by the end of the century.
How did the U of M and the Energy Transition Lab participate in COP21?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have the good fortune as a major research institution of being able to be official observers to the United Nations climate change process. And this was secured, the status was secured a number of years ago, and the first time that I made use of it was even before I worked here. Well, I was an adjunct professor, and I was still in the legislature, but I taught a class in 2010 and was able to take a group of students to the COP16 in Mexico, and it was a life-changing experience for these students to go and learn firsthand what it's like to be part of this negotiation of well over 100 countries trying to figure out and tackle these gigantic challenges for the world. And so it was very educational and very informative. And I think research institutions have a very important role to play in this. The UN process is set up so that there's different sectors can participate as observers. So we're not official parties, we don't get to negotiate, but we get to observe and be in the room for a lot of the decision making.
When Access Minnesota returns, more with Ellen Anderson from the University of Minnesota's Energy Transition Lab on the consequences of the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Now more of our conversation with Ellen Anderson from the University of Minnesota's Energy Transition Lab on the consequences of the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord. What is lost following President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Agreement?
That's a great question, and part of it remains to be seen. I think first we have to acknowledge that President Obama's leadership was fundamentally critical to get the Paris Agreement done. And so what President Obama did by really working with leaders of China and India and other major greenhouse gas emitters and getting them to come to the table and make pledges to reduce emissions, along with President Obama's efforts to put into stone carve into stone the U.S.'s pledges to reduce emissions through the Clean Power Plan and vehicle emissions reduction standards, CAFE standards for higher fuel efficiency, all those different measures that President Obama took so that the U.S. had binding targets that we were prepared to meet to reduce emissions. All of those things really helped catalyze Paris coming to fruition. And so what it did was solidify the United States as the global leader in this effort. And what President Trump has done is pulled the rug out from that and taken away the United States mantle of leadership. I think there will also be ripple effects on our economy and our energy system, clearly. I was at the COP22 in Marrakesh last year, the second meeting, the meeting after Paris, and it was right after the election, the U.S. election, and China representatives were there saying, "Hey, we're going to step up. No problem. We will take over and lead the charge." And so that's really not good for America's status in the world. Another aspect of it can be that with all these countries agreeing to take action on reducing carbon, many of them are going to set policies in place that could include carbon pricing, carbon taxes, carbon tariffs, which could affect U.S. businesses. And think about Minnesota, where we have more Fortune 500 companies per capita than I think any other state. We have a lot of companies that operate in the global marketplace. And they won't be able to sell their products without a penalty if they don't comply with carbon reductions that companies in those countries have to face. And so that could be something that puts us at an economic disadvantage. Another piece that could be really troublesome in terms of our economy generally, and this is a little hard to read because obviously our energy sector in our energy sector in the United States is booming with fracking and natural gas and the growth of that and the ability to export natural gas. So the American energy sector is strong, but given the energy transition that the world is embarking on to move to lower carbon sources and the rapid growth of renewable energy around the world, which is really overtaking the growth of fossil fuels around the world, and it has been for several years. If we are not leaders in that innovation, which we have been in the past, we're going to be losers in that sector. And that could mean less investment in renewable energy projects, research, development, et cetera, in our country. So then the last piece of it is really in terms of the impact of the president's action. It may not have that much impact directly on what happens in that global agreement to have the U.S. not be part of it, except for that loss of influence. What will really make a difference is what happens with the U.S. policy. So as I mentioned, each country had to set their own target. That's called their Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDC. And the U.S.'s target was, said that we're going to reduce carbon emissions 26 to 28% across our economy by 2030. And again, President Obama set that in motion with the Clean Power Plan, which said we're going to cut emissions from coal-fired power plants dramatically, and a number of other actions that he took, reducing vehicle emissions and appliance efficiency and all kinds of other actions to trying to reduce leakage and methane leaks that were putting greenhouse gases in the environment, a number of actions that were taken under the Obama administration. If President Trump reverses those regulatory actions, then we will see potentially that we will lose ground in meeting those targets. So I think that's the most interesting question, at least domestically. How much progress can we make despite the lack of federal regulations? And I think it's interesting to see that there's a lot of potential for making progress. Now, we've already gotten about halfway to the targets that President Obama set for the country. We've already gotten about halfway to that 26 to 28% reduction, which is really remarkable. I mean, the Clean Power Plan rule was just adopted and it's been in court ever since. But just the fact that it was announced and it was planned and a lot of people spent a lot of time talking about it and planning for it meant that it set in motion a lot of retirements of coal plants. Because utilities look at the future, they do long-term planning before they make big infrastructure investments. And they could see the writing on the wall. And when they have an older coal plant that is polluting, they're often realizing it's just not economical to keep them running when they have cheaper alternatives. So that's a long answer to your question.
Does backing out of the Paris Agreement affect any of the work you're doing at the Energy Transition Lab?
Well, I think what this does is it just gives us a greater, kind of a stronger charge of our mission, which is try to help communities, cities, and states like Minnesota and the Midwest, regions like the Midwest, try to advance our energy transition. What is going to happen now is that the action in the energy transition and the action in reducing carbon is shifting away from the federal level to states, to cities, to universities, to businesses, and that's where a great deal of progress is being made. And that's where we work. That's the kind of impact that we are already having.
President Trump and many Republicans have framed the Paris Agreement as a jobs killer, but others argue that renewable energy sector jobs will flourish going forward, and they may indeed surpass those of the coal energy sector if that hasn't already happened. What are the numbers that you are seeing with regards to the jobs?
Yeah, well, that's absolutely the case in Minnesota for sure. So in Minnesota, when I was working for the state of Minnesota, we worked on a report in 2014 called the Clean Energy Economy Profile, which is available online from the state government. We looked at and did some economic modeling of jobs in the state of Minnesota to see what had changed over the past 15 years since we started creating renewable energy policies in the state of Minnesota. And we found that in the state of Minnesota that at least 15,000 new jobs had been created during that time period. And a lot of it was due to policies that were created, like our renewable energy standard. And that these jobs were growing at a rate faster than the rest of the economy, so growing very quickly, and that they are higher paying jobs than average jobs. And so you have this big new economic sector that's growing and creating a lot of opportunity, especially in wind, solar, and energy efficiency. My center, the Energy Transition Lab, did another report back in last November of 2016, right around a little after the election. We published that report that looked at projects that are being planned in wind and solar that were just being planned right now in the last year, that people had already put money into. They were real projects. They were waiting in the queue to be approved by our grid operator. And we found that if those projects that were in the queue were all built as proposed, it would create another 5,000 new jobs, and most of those jobs would be in 19 rural counties in Minnesota. And so rural parts of the country really stand to gain a lot from this new clean energy economy.
It's a myth that many American companies, including oil and energy companies, are against the climate change agreement. Why did many U.S. companies oppose President Trump's decision?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think part of it goes back to that economic global competitiveness that I mentioned before, that if they're global players, they see that they need to go where they have to follow where the hockey puck's going, right? And that's the future. And they see that to be successful in other markets, customers are demanding, and their supply chain companies are demanding that they be sustainable and green and reduce their carbon footprint. And farmers in Minnesota have commented on this, that even if they're not personally concerned about reducing their carbon emissions, they want their products to end up on Walmart's green shelf. That's where the money is, that's where the market is going. And so I think it's a matter of, pure really economics and planning for the future. It's kind of an inevitable future.
When Access Minnesota returns, a look at ways to depoliticize the conversation on climate change.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Now more of our conversation with Ellen Anderson from the University of Minnesota's Energy Transition Lab. Ellen will talk about ways to depoliticize the conversation on climate change. Is there a way to depoliticize the climate change discussion?
I'll give you two examples, actually. One is my own personal experience. So as a state senator, I worked on renewable energy policy for many years, and I tried to pass our renewable energy standard for 6 years in the state of Minnesota. And when I first introduced the bill, which called for, at that time in 2001, we started kind of small and said, let's have a requirement that at least 10% of our electricity comes from renewable sources by 2015. People thought that was politically unrealistic and technically impossible. We had utility engineers who said the highest amount of renewable energy we'll ever have in our system and have a reliable electricity system is 3%. Well, they were obviously wrong. And now they now they're, Xcel Energy, our biggest utility, is leading the charge as the #1 wind utility, and Minnesota is now producing at least 23% of our electricity from renewables. So what happened from 2001 to 2007, as we debated, discussed, and argued about the future of renewable energy and what was possible, people's minds got changed slowly but surely. And part of it, I think, was because of those jobs in rural Minnesota, the opportunity for economic development, the opportunity for jobs and business development, and the broadening understanding that clean energy development is good for our economy, and the broadening understanding that climate change is something we need to do something about. In 2007, the legislature came together, and we had a Democratic legislature and a Republican governor in control in 2007. And at the end of the day, we passed the Renewable Energy Standard and the Next Generation Energy Act. And the Next Generation Energy Act sets statewide greenhouse gas targets that say we're going to cut emissions 80% by 2050 based on UN targets. We passed those bills in 2007 nearly unanimously. So it was kind of a miraculous shift in attitude and public opinion. And so I know it's happened before, and I know that means it can happen again. One other example I want to give is some really interesting political alliances that have developed with the Tea Party. So in some states, like in Georgia, the head of the Georgia Tea Party, Debbie Dooley, got involved trying to advocate for citizens who wanted to put solar energy installations on their homes. They wanted to put solar panels on their roof, produce their own energy, and they thought, to make them energy independent. And they were having trouble with their utility, and the utility wouldn't pay them for the extra energy that they produced. And so they formed an alliance with the Sierra Club and created something called the Green Tea Coalition, which is kind of funny, but it's actually a real thing around the country that a number of places have kind of found this alliance between conservatives and liberals to say, hey, we can find some common ground on saying that we think that developing more of our own renewable sources can make us a stronger nation. And we can all find common ground on that. So again, I think there's some possibilities, but it's not easy, and it feels like we're a million miles away from that in Washington right now.
What role do you see the U of M and the ETL playing in Minnesota's green energy future?
Well, some of the things that we're working on right now at ETL include working with cities and helping cities in the metropolitan region implement energy and climate planning as they do their comprehensive plans that they have to do in the metropolitan region. And so we're trying to help them develop the tools so they can figure out, hey, if we want to reduce our carbon emissions by 30% in the next decade, what would that take? What are some research-driven strategies that we know you can really accurately account for savings from? So we're trying to help them develop the tools that can accurately measure and develop strategies that will work to reduce carbon emissions based on a lot of research that's been done around the world. So we're doing that. We have a project that we're affiliated with that's working with 5 cities around the state of Minnesota, both rural and urban areas, that are partnering with Germany cities. And they're looking at the energy transition that's been made in some German cities where they've evolved to being 100% energy self-sufficient. And so they're exchanging visits and they're learning from each other. And this is something that the university is leading. So there's lots of different ways we can make a difference. And then the energy storage work that I mentioned, we are working directly with decision makers in our state Public Utilities Commission and our state government, with companies and with utilities to help explore how can we reduce waste in our energy system by using energy storage? How can we enable more renewable energy deployment in our energy system by using energy storage? What benefits can it bring to the grid, and what's the most cost-effective and proven ways of using that technology? So those are some of the things that we are doing. We're very interested in practical results, practical solutions to really the biggest challenges that are facing us.
Ellen Anderson is the Executive Director of the University of Minnesota's Energy Transition Lab. Professor Anderson, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
Thank you so much.
That's all for this month's edition of Access Minnesota. We'll see you again next month. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.